welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we are talking to Dr. Muthukumara Mani, lead environmental economist at the World Bank. Welcome, Dr. Mani.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for coming. And before we start our conversation, let me introduce Dr. Mani. Prior to joining the World Bank, Dr. Mani worked for the International Monetary Fund, where he was responsible for analyzing the environmental implications of macroeconomic policies. Dr. Mani has a doctorate and master's degree in economy from the University of Maryland, College Park. And he has also recently edited the book, Greening India's Growth. So Dr. Mani, to start our conversation, let's talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
How was that journey from economist to environmental economist?
It's a very good question, yes. Again, when I started studying economics in my university, my focus was going to be on development, because coming from a developing country, I thought it would be important to study the challenges of a developing country, the economy, and what can be done to improve the country's economic progress. But then at that time, when I started studying development economics, I just came across this whole field of environment and natural resource economics.
When was that about? What year?
It was probably around 1990. I came to this country in 1988. So during my coursework, you can say, when I started thinking about what
discovering
environmental economics, and I realized that how relevant it was for our development perspective, which a lot of people didn't see or understand the linkages between how natural resources play a key role in the economy and economic growth. So that's when my interest kind of shifted in terms of studying the environmental problems, but more again from a developing country perspective. I feel that in the West, environmental movement has been quite strong in the 80s, and there's been a lot of research. But when I started my PhD, I realized that there's not much in developing countries in terms of the environmental economics. So that's when I thought it will be a good contribution.
In that sense, were you kind of a pioneer from India, or were there other mentors or examples you found on your way?
One of the first kind of genuine environmental economists coming out of college, yes. In that sense, I would think yes.
And when you mentioned developing countries and developed countries and how different the situation was, how much more awareness there was in the developed countries as opposed to developing, when you started your research, did you find that the challenges are similar or different, and that the approaches are similar or different? And it's a broad question, but just a few ideas.
Yes, I think a lot of time there's a kind of a push in developing countries to adapt or to what's going on adapt the models of what's going on in developed countries, and that's a mistake because obviously the developed countries when they were growing, they faced similar problems, but at that time they did not really take care of the environment. I mean, if you see many of these developed countries, they've grown because they destroyed their forests, they built cities, roads, highways. And now, so a lot of developing countries feel that that's their solution: grow now and clean up later. Their first job should be to focus on economic growth, but then, when you look at the developing countries today, that model is not going to work because
it's not replicable.
It's not replicable. First of all, because a lot of these developing countries, their whole economies are based on natural resources, and they have a lot of poor people who are dependent on natural resources. And clearly, in terms of sheer number of people, if you take countries like India and China, which are growing fast, and if you look at the environmental problems, you're talking about billions of people. So clearly, given that there are billions of people are impacted by environmental problems, clearly it's growing now, cleaning up later is no longer a solution for developing countries. They have to grow.
How difficult is it to convey this to policymakers and to people themselves who actually want to replicate what was supposed to be a successful growth and development story?
Yes, so there are three key messages that I'll go back to my book. One is that we can call it green growth, because countries have to grow green. Green growth is necessary. and it's affordable and it's measurable. Now,
can you just define for us green growth so
yes.
we all know that we are on the
Yes.
same page? Yeah.
So green growth, again, it's a new term. It used to be called as sustainable development. Now, sustainable development was that the economic development is grounded on the principle of economic, social, and environmental sustainability, and you make sure that you don't damage your natural capital when you're growing. But then, over the years, what has happened is that a lot of people felt that when you talk of sustainable development, you're actually putting a brake on the economic growth of the countries. So it's kind of a backlash against the environmentalists saying that you guys are not letting us grow. So I think the whole green growth movement, or as a term, came about to kind of convince countries that it's actually good for growth. Because previously the idea was the environment, anything that you do to protect the environment was bad for growth.
It's going to damage the economy.
Yes. Yeah. So the whole green growth idea, philosophy, you can call it, is that countries can actually grow green. Yeah. They don't have to sacrifice on the economy if they take care of the environment.
So you mentioned your 3 principles,
Yes.
that the green growth is necessary and it's measurable and it's affordable.
Yeah.
Could you expand on that a little bit?
So why is green growth necessary? For example, let me give you the example of India, because that's where my book is focusing on. India really experienced economic growth in the last 2 decades. Really, it's now one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's going to overtake China in the next year or 2. And growth also has, because I grew up in India, I know that the India today is very different from the India that I grew up in. Also has provided a lot of developmental benefits. Millions of people have come out of poverty. Millions of people have now become middle class. Their affordability has improved. So clearly there are huge developmental benefits of growth. So India, if you look at from an economic point of view, globally India is one of the most, say, top 3 or 4 countries in terms of sheer growth of GDP and also sheer the volume of GDP.
Yes.
But if you
and a model for many other countries that are
exactly,
rising.
yeah. But at the same time, if you look at the environment, so if you look at let's say the global environmental index that's put out by Yale University, you find that India is at rock bottom, like 176 out of 178 countries. So India's environmental performance is kind of at the rock bottom, while its economic performance is at the top. So clearly there is a dichotomy. And so for the people who feel that countries can grow out of environmental problems, clearly it's a misnomer, because India's growth has actually worsened its environmental degradation. If you go to any city in India, if let's say the capital city Delhi, which is now recently it's over to Beijing as one of the most polluted city in the world.
Yeah,
and there are similarly there are number of cities across India where the pollution levels are far above any prescribed WHO standards. So clearly environment has deteriorated, the quality of rivers is terrible. I know. So one of the things that we did in this study was to kind of, how do we convince the policymakers, because they're the ones who are driving the economy, put a value on the environmental degradation. So it came to about 5.7% of GDP. So once you start talking about those numbers.
So when you deduct it from the number.
Yeah, you can say that environment is a huge cost. It's about annually 5.7% of GDP, and that's got the attention of the policymakers to forcing them to do something. So in terms of, similarly for China, I think the range is from about 9 to 10% of GDP. So if you look at these countries and if you start putting number as a percentage of GDP, then it really shows that green growth is necessary, because obviously if they don't take care of the environment, the cost is going to continue to increase, and it can eventually act as a brake on growth.
So how can you talked about this dichotomy between the economic growth and then the environmental degradation. Yeah. So it seems they need to be integrated somehow in the evaluation system and in the monitoring system. Yeah. And I understand it's part of the environmental economics. So what can we do? What can be done at the national and international level to integrate it?
Sure. So that's actually that's where the field of environmental economics becomes so important today, because on one hand you have the environmentalists who want to protect the environment at all costs, right? who want to make sure that the planet is no longer destroyed, it's preserved. On the other hand, you are economists. When I say economists, I mean the traditional growth economists or macroeconomists who really believe that economic growth is most important for everything.
And the environment that sustains it is not in question.
They don't even. So what environmental economists do, is we try to bridge the two worlds: the environmentalist world of extreme, protection of environment, and the economist view. We feel that there's clearly no one way or the other. There needs to be a balance. So you protect the environment to that extent that you don't do a big damage to the economy. At the same time, you also make sure that environmental damage doesn't exceed.
So you also mentioned that the green economy and the green growth is affordable.
Yes.
That's often very questioned. There is always this argument, well, solar energy is so expensive, oil is cheap,
Yes.
and so how is it affordable?
There are, I think, what we show again in the study is there are a lot of things that the countries can do, which are very low cost options that can actually improve the environment and without having an impact on economic growth. Just let me give an example. In India, coal is a major source for generating electricity. And so we have coal plants generating a lot of electricity, but also a lot of emissions and so on. And India's coal has high ash content. That's also a major cause of pollution. So one simple solution for dealing with this high ash content is to wash coal, before it's actually processed. And washing coal is not a huge cost. So clearly, and there are studies that have shown that if you actually start using washed coal, that considerably reduces the health damage from.
But it's hard to imagine it's going to happen just by private sector initiative itself, or have there been any good experience, or there should be a policy?
It has to come from the government. It has to be policy. It has to be mandatory policy, because right now only 4% of the total coal that's processed is washed, so which is very small number. If you increase that 4% to even 20%, the health benefits are huge. Yeah. So again, from an economic point of view, when we calculate the health damage from air pollution, let's say in cities, it's huge. It's almost comes to about 3% of GDP. Out of the 5.7%, 3% is from air pollution, both in the cities and also in rural areas where poor people use wood for cooking.
Right.
Yeah. So let me focus on the cities. So if you take cities, and cities also are engines of economic growth, that's where the most productive activities happen. So because of the pollution, you are actually impacting the most productive part of the population, the urban adults, right? So obviously you cannot expect that you're continue to impact their health and expect that they will continue to contribute to the economy. So that's where I think
and the dichotomy is also because these are the same people we have brought from poor villages that didn't have any sustenance.
Exactly.
So now they are brought into maybe lower middle class, and they're doing much better, but then their health is in danger.
And they're not.
And they can become unproductive, or they could die.
Yeah, they could die, or they could fall sick, and so obviously the more they fall sick, they'll be less productive they'll be for the economy. So clearly that's something that, and then there are a number of fixes, for example, energy efficiency. So only not go to this extreme of thinking that all this environmental cleanup is going to be expensive, but I think there are measures that countries can take. So the challenge is to identify those measures.
Can you give us maybe a few successful examples from India, or maybe from the world around? Because I know you've been studying these subjects for many years.
Yes.
Any good practices that have actually reduced successfully pollution and have been implemented, and how they have been implemented? Did they come from the private sector? Did they come from the policymakers and the government, or international organizations?
Well, I can give you one example which we are now trying to implement in India is to how kind of deal with industrial pollution. So one of the things that actually that started that whole methodology was started in Indonesia, where they said, look, it's not the pollution agencies don't have the budget to even go and monitor these hundreds and thousands of factories. So there has to be a way in which you make sure that the factories are complying with environmental standards, but at the same time not invest too much in terms of expanding the pollution control agency. So they came up with an innovative rating scheme where they said, look, we are going to provide a rating for industries in terms of like gold, green, blue, red, black, and so on and so forth, based on their environmental performance, and we are going to make it public. And that way, even if we don't punish a certain factory, when people see that there is a factory that's rated black or red in their neighborhood, they will go and try to shut down.
So they are appealing to the power of the consumers.
Consumers, exactly. Yes. So it's a public disclosure program where so you don't need a whole amount of resources that you need to in terms of inspecting each and every factory, but then you put together a mechanism where the industries also self-report, and then you can do once in a while audits, checks on these, and then the whole public pressure makes the industries very kind of aware that they have to.
And it can eventually then result in a public policy and a government measure.
Exactly, because I think
through the constituency.
Exactly, because I think unlike the developed countries, a lot of developing countries are not in a position yet to introduce measures like the environmental tax and so on and so forth. So
because there are a lot of socio-economic pressing issues from the population.
Yeah, so I think this is one kind of using consumers. I think is a big way in which you can actually start doing things at a low cost, and that can be replicated.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Mani. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. We'd like to recommend again the book Greening India's Growth, and which we really enjoyed reading.
Sure.
And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we spoke to Dr. Muthukumara Mani, the lead environmental economist at the World Bank.